Hello everyone. Thank you very much for sticking with us for this Q&A. I'm so glad to see so many of you staying put. Without further ado, let me greet my two guests up, not on quite the stage, but at the front. Roberto, please help yourself to a seat. And John, somewhere in the toilet. A misfiring introduction there. We'll wait for John. In the meantime, that'll give you a little bit of time to gather your thoughts, reflect on the film we've just seen, think up some questions. Any comments you have as well will be welcome. I'll be speaking to Roberto and John. I'll be asking them a few questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. I should mention that this is recorded. We have a sort of podcast for the Garden Cinema, which you can find on our main page, gardencinema.co.uk. We have videos and podcasts. So I will be recording this and introducing this again more formally. If any of you want to speak out and ask a question but don't want to be included in the recording, that's not a problem at all. Just speak to me at the end and I'll just edit this out. Okay, well, John. He returned. Oh, John gets his own little jazz intro. I don't know what's happened there. There we go. This is my plan B for recording. I never trust the... Oh, mine. Is it good now? Yes. So thank you very much, John, for joining us. Start that again. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Garden Cinema. That was Chicago Boys to mark the 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile. And the screening was organized in collaboration with Alborada. So thank you very much to the team behind Alborada. And we are here joined after the film for a Q&A with journalist John McEvoy and scientist and researcher and ex-political prisoner Roberto Navarrete. So thank you so much to our two guests. I'll let you grab a mic each. And after this, we will be opening it up to the audience for some comments and questions and so on. First of all, watching this, I wanted to ask you, Roberto, really, what the impact of those neoliberal policies. We see them very clearly in the first years after the coup, but where are we at today? How have they infused in the kind of the daily life of the country over the years? Is their impact still very much felt, or has it changed over the years? Where are we at with the consequences of this neoliberal school of thought?
Okay, so can you hear me? No. Okay.
The mic should be on. I can.
John, try this one and then.
Not at all. I
Hello?
will just.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try that one first. Okay, so the question is, does neoliberalism exist in Chile today as it was planned by the Chicago Boys that you saw in the film? And the answer is emphatically yes, because a process of political change, I mean, I am a scientist of the biological sciences and neuroscience in particular, and to me it is inconceivable that people can think that a subject such as economics is detached from politics, which are both related to the organization of society in different ways. And we heard people saying several times, I'm not political. You know, I didn't know that this was happening. Was torture happening while you were a minister? Oh, no, it was news to me. Why? Because that wasn't my job to do. This is inconceivable, apart from being intellectually dishonest. And so the answer to your question is, unfortunately, what was started at the point of a gun created conditions for lasting change in Chilean society, which have resulted certainly in certain level of, Chile is a modern country integrated to the world economy, And some people have made huge amount of money, and you can see it in the streets, as you saw in the pictures of the buildings, new buildings, etc. But the vast majority of people do not share in that situation. And so somebody there said, oh, we have a $20,000 per capita income, but ask anyone, where are their $20,000? Because obviously, you know, as there was a Chilean poet called Nicanor Parra, and it says, I have 2 eggs, and you have none. So I eat 2 eggs, the other one, but the average is 1. This is the situation. I think that's enough of an answer, I think, because I think we want to touch other aspects, I'm sure.
Well, I was, incidentally, I wanted to talk a bit about the societal changes that happened around the time. And we don't really address that shift. So can you tell us a bit more about what it was like to live under Allende's I don't really want to say regime, but government, really. How much of a shift was there suddenly, societal, not only economical, but in the way the country operated? What were you trying to hark back to?
Right. I think we have to go before Allende, in fact, because what was happening in the world, even in Britain, was, remember, the welfare state in Britain started after the war. Well, in Chile, we didn't participate in the war, but there was certainly an economic policy of import substitution industrialization. Basically, we wanted to industrialize the country, and that meant that we had to make TV sets. We had to, at least, if not make whole cars, but at least arm the cars in our country, and that's what the country, that was the path of development that the country took. How was it felt as a person? Well, I was a student in the 60s. We had free education at the level of school and university. I came as a refugee to Britain, having been a medical student for 2 years before the coup, and I had to leave the country. I was imprisoned for a while. And my level of education allowed me to continue without any problems my education here. I got a PhD, and I managed to. So our country was producing or giving opportunities to people that allow them to fulfill themselves. Now, we were a poor country. I mean, there's no, and is it true what one of the Chicago boys says, that it was a sort of gray country. It wasn't full of flashy buildings and all that. But we had 2 Nobel Prizes in literature, Pablo Neruda and Gabriela Mistral, and we were proud of that rather than, you know, how many dollars per capita we were supposed to have.
Fair enough. And just kind of out of curiosity, I mean, I will go back to I want to talk a bit about the more recent events in Chile. But how popular are these economic policies amongst people in the country? I know a lot of people suffer from their consequences, but I'm comparing it to, say, even Britain, where there's a big disconnect between the way people live and how they understand the economic policies that govern the way they live. So in Chile, are people are these policies is the system popular with Chileans? Would they, when they well, I mean, I wanted to go back to this afterwards, but let's just say in 2019 we saw a big uprising, and there was a clear will amongst the people to change the conditions there. How popular was that amongst the citizens of the country?
This is a very difficult question for me to answer because I live here now, although I visit the country every year for at least 2 months. But I look at the country from outside, and it's difficult to answer for the following reason. It's quite obvious that a choice was made, and I think we have to go back to the immediate post-dictatorship period, because a conscious decision was made by the parties of the left that previously had supported Allende to not change the economic model that Pinochet had installed. It was not consulted with the people. It was done at the popular level, and so how much support did it have? Well, it had enough support for governments to be elected that said that they were going to keep this economic model because it was producing certain goods. But what is the economic? I mean, I want to say Chile is primarily a country, an exporter of minerals. I mean, the added value of the products that Chile has is still minimal, even after all this neoliberal revolution. So before, in the 1800s, we produced, and early 1900s, we produced nitrates. Chile was the first exporter of nitrates in the world, which was the main fertilizer for agriculture at the time. So the wealth of Chile was, again, for a tiny minority, and in fact, British, in the case, there was the Baron of Nitrate was a guy called North, I forgot his name, and there was a civil war, a revolution, where another president was overthrown, President Balmaceda, in 1891, as a result of interests that he wanted to change the situation of ownership of the minerals. In the case of Allende, Allende nationalized copper. Chile is the first, the world first producer of copper. It was then, and it is still now. But the ownership of the mines was in the hands of foreign multinational companies. So the very fact that these two presidents attempted to change this model of development resulted in huge upheavals in the country.
Thank you. I'm actually going to segue slightly towards you, John, because you mentioned British involvement. I know, John, I don't know if it's via that angle that you started to research the topic, but I know that in your work you've explored the British influence, I guess, in terms of what happened in Chile. Could you talk a bit more about that? What's Britain's role in this?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, the route that I kind of took into looking into British foreign policy in Chile was in early 2020, in January 2020 actually, and it was maybe 3 weeks after the declassification into the UK National Archives of over 10,000 files, which related to a secret Foreign Office unit named the Information Research Department, and this opened up a kind of a whole new avenue of kind of research in Latin America, but particularly in Chile, because what these files revealed was that the UK government had been covertly interfering in Chile against Salvador Allende for almost a decade prior to him being first elected in 1970. So, I mean, obviously many people know about the US role in destabilising Chile and destabilising the economy, covert operations against Allende, and also the support to the Pinochet regime. And I mean, some of the documents were referenced in the film, like the Church Committee, for example, which exposed not the full range, but the wide range of CIA covert operations against Allende during the 60s and 70s. But what these documents showed us, it wasn't just the US participating in these kinds of activities in Chile, and the British government was actually one of the key players in trying to prevent Allende from ever coming to power, and also trying to destabilise him once he was in power. So I'll just briefly explain what the IRD was for those who don't know what it was. So it was a secret propaganda unit within the British Foreign Office. It was so secret that, of course, members of the public didn't know about it, but most members of Parliament didn't know about it either. It was only known by like a select group of diplomats, spooks, and high-ranking Foreign Office officials. And what it did basically was collect information on communism and left-wing organisation activities, and produce all forms of informational activity and distribute it worldwide to agents of influence, so military figures, politicians, journalists, trade unionists, student organisations, and so on and so forth. And the idea was to build resilience against left-wing activities worldwide, but also to cultivate agents of influence in foreign countries. But during the early 1960s, and particularly 1962, and this is 4 years after Allende almost wins a presidential election in Chile, the IRD's activities in Latin America intensify massively, and they start sending out IRD specialist officers called field officers, who are tasked with engaging in covert propaganda activities, so placing information in the press, providing either true or false information to certain groups in order to split the left in Chile, and also to support Allende's foremost political opponent. So in that time, in the 1964 election, it was Eduardo Frei. And so what these documents revealed for the first time, whereas we had information about what the CIA was up to since the 70s, that the UK was also engaged in these kinds of covert activities. And this didn't just occur during the 60s, it happened in the 70s as well during the Allende presidency. But even more recently, declassified files in early 2022 have shown that in the immediate aftermath of the coup, the British government actively facilitated Chile's military intelligence by way of disseminating material on British counterinsurgency operations across Southeast Asia, particularly Malaya, which, as many of you will know, was a brutal counterinsurgency campaign. It involved the resettlement of over 500,000 civilians, mass internment, brutal repression, including beheadings and so on and so forth. So the colonial policing model that Britain was using across Southeast Asia and also Africa was being taught to Latin America's and particularly Chile's military intelligence. And following that, I mean, there's a relationship, as many of you know, between Margaret Thatcher and Augusto Pinochet, which we can get onto later. But that was the avenue basically that I got into with regards to British foreign policy in Chile.
And more out of curiosity, and now I'm worried I might have missed any mention of that, but how, what was their I mean, both the US and Britain intervened to destabilize the country and create the coup, but did they cooperate in terms of liaising with, or rather coordinating that kind of influential thought process, teaching of economics and also covert propaganda and so on?
Yeah, well, the extent of British collaboration with the US, so basically in the declassified files, you have what was an IRD annual report, and it was basically a template where they spoke about what kind of covert operations they were up to, what kind of communist activities were happening. And when you get to point F, which was collaboration with the CIA, redacted, massive black, sometimes full pages, sometimes much smaller. The UK government is comprehensively refusing to release the material on its collaboration with the CIA. But you can kind of piece together some kind of collaboration in certain fields. So they assisted US-based media organisations or CIA-funded media organisations in Chile, such as Forum World Features, which basically was sent to Chile to report on the first years of the Allende government, and obviously, slag it off and say it was terrible, the economy is awful. And so, yeah, I mean, the extent of British collaboration with the US is unclear. There obviously was a certain extent of collaboration. But what's quite interesting is recently, and this only came out via a court battle in Australia, it was found that the Australian Secret Intelligence Service opened up a station in Santiago in 1971, and their core role was basically to act as proxies to the CIA, to basically assist the CIA in its covert destabilisation operations. But what we know is that MI6 had a station in the British Embassy in Santiago since the 1960s, was engaged in all of the kind of meddling during the 1960s. And we know that in 1972, a CIA officer called David Spedding was posted to Chile. He would go on to head MI6 between 1994 and 1999. So he was posted there before, during and after the coup. He finally left Chile in 1974 when the Labour Party came back to power. And they closed down the MI6 station in Santiago because they didn't want, with the change of British policy to Chile, they didn't want the Pinochet regime to think that it was engaging in covert destabilization campaigns against it, which kind of suggests what they were up to at the time when it was open. So we know the MI6 station was there, but there's been no documents declassified about what it was actually up to. But given the US's historic collaboration with Britain, given Britain's typical role in anti-left-wing activity abroad and suppression of left-wing movements, I would be amazed if A, the CIA didn't request assistance from MI6 in Chile, and B, if Britain said no.
Well, I just want to ask one question before I pass the mic to the audience. In regards to this, would you be able to tell us more about the situation today in terms of intervention, I guess, or influence? Has Britain been involved at all in recent events in Chile, in anything post 2019? Has there been any sort of activity there that might have?
Well, I mean, I'm not I'm not as much. I don't have as much knowledge in general about the present day. I'm more focused on history, but I mean, Chile at the moment. I mean, there was a recent coup in Bolivia. And Bolivia, alongside Chile, has one of the greatest reserves of lithium in the world. And as a colleague at Declassified UK found that Britain kind of assisted and supported the coup in Bolivia in order to get its hands on what they called the white gold, the lithium. So there's a key material interest at the moment in Chile, which is its lithium, and of course the copper. The copper interests remain. Yeah. And James Cleverly, of course, the Foreign Secretary recently went to Santiago and, brought out all the old stories. Britain is Chile's oldest friends because Britain, contributed to some degree in the wars of independence, if not for independence itself, but in order to supplant the Spanish as the main economic power in the region. But nonetheless, it plays off this historic role. So the Britain still has material interests. We also know that during the Piñera years that Britain was selling arms that it knew could be used for internal repression to the Chilean government, which were then used, and people's eyes were being shot out. There was horrendous repression, and Britain was profiting from this, as it generally profits from conflict abroad because it's one of the world's leading arms manufacturers. So there's a number of interests. I imagine Britain isn't particularly keen on Boric, but I don't know much particularly about any covert. Yeah, we'll have to wait another judging on the latest declassification, we'll have to wait at least 60 years actually. So yeah, because a lot of the files from the 60s are actually still classified. So
yeah, it was interesting to see whether or not geopolitically things had changed to an extent where Britain just didn't want to bother with any of that anymore, but focused on internal issues or another part of the world. Thank you very much. I'm going to give it over to the audience. We already have a hand there. The roving mic's just going to come to you, and then someone in the middle there. Just thank you.
Thank you very much. So my question is, in the film there's reference, and you've also referenced it as well, both of you, the economic situation under Allende that was used as a basis for the coup. And you've, John, mentioned some of you've referenced the fact that there were covert operations to destabilize, but there hasn't been any actual, could you either of you give any kind of details to the type of things that were done, both from foreign actors like the United States and from within Chile as well, in order to destabilize the country? I mean, most people may be aware of the fact that there's a famous note that Richard Nixon, the president, wrote to the head of the CIA saying, "Make the economy scream," in reference to after Allende was elected. But what did that mean in practice?
Well, to start with, yes, that was done, by the way, even before Allende took power. This was the result of a meeting between it was referenced in the film also, the owner of the largest right-wing newspaper called El Mercurio, with the head of Pepsi Cola, who was a personal friend of Nixon. And this was between the election of Allende on the 4th of September 1970 and the assumption to power of Allende on I think it was October the something. So this meeting took place within days of the election, winning the election, but before Allende actually took power. Now that's crucial because it shows that the attempt was to not to allow a democratically elected government to fulfill its mandate to the people, including its economic program, which was open, obviously, because if you're going to win an election, you have to say what you're going to do. So nationalization of copper was part of it. And again, somebody said, or someone said, one American president said that America has interest. It doesn't have friends, it has interests. And in the case of Chile, it's quite clear. Now, what did they do? They subverted the whole economy from the very beginning. For example, the price of copper was manipulated at the international level from the beginning. Loans were denied to Allende's government at the time. When the strikes began, strikes were created artificially by funding the strikers to be on strike. And this happens to the lorry owners in 1972 that were paid a salary to be on strike with American dollars. Okay, so obviously a country that is a small country, but it is a very long country. Without the trucks working and moving the goods on the country grinds to a halt, which it did. So there was a huge lack of foods, no fuel for transport. The country was virtually paralyzed. And it's interesting that before, the very first year of Allende, there was a huge increase in production before the effect of the American intervention in the economy. And not only that, Allende, who was elected with 36 and something percent of the vote, increased its votes in the municipal election to 50.5% of the vote. In spite of all this action, this sabotage of the economy, Allende ended his government with 43% of the vote, with the whole economy collapsing as it was. So it was quite clear that the people of Chile were not entirely fooled by this intervention in the democratic process in Chile.
Thank you very much. Did you want to add anything, John?
Just a very brief one on the, just simply one example, because we've just published a article today in Declassified. We interviewed Salvador Allende's grandson, Pablo Allende, and in that article we reference one recently declassified file from 1969, and the IRD field officer is basically saying, in order to encourage people to vote against Allende, they're encouraging Chileans to believe that there would be foreign interference against him. So they're basically, in order to, in a really kind of like sinisterly paradoxical way, in order to prevent a coup, don't vote for him because, you know, the US are probably going to get involved here. So so this is a kind of dedication that the British government had to democracy at this point. Yeah.
Thank you. We had someone there. There, just a hand there, the third row. Thank you.
Just wanted to make a comment about the movie. It's incredible that these Chicago boys who were training on neoliberalism, which was all about competition, in fact, work together, study together, help each other, have great parties, even though they had different political, sides. And that wasn't picked up by anybody. It was like, hang on a second, they are giving this school of Chicago a demonstration of how to work together, help each other, and go ahead as a team. And they were baffled. Another thing was that the minister that said that he didn't notice there were all these deaths reminds me of the Nazi officials. A lot of people in the Nazi that said, well, we couldn't hear we saw all these trains with Jewish, but we couldn't imagine what was going to happen. It's incredible, the lack of self-reflection and also noticing the reality on all these people. They have tried the same things to Venezuela. They did try to with Chavez and now with Maduro. Funny enough, in Venezuela, the coup d'etat, the first coup d'etat against Chavez was organized by the media, certain of society, some military men, and obviously the son of the person who got the Pepsi Cola concession in Venezuela too, so it's not far off, and they haven't been able to defeat Venezuela. So I guess that's despite using exactly the same recipe. So I think that's something positive.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there is a sense I felt in the film that it's kind of people playing God a little bit, philosophizing and coming up with these theories without any care of their impact on the ground. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that comment, either of you.
Just very briefly, I mean, the other contradiction of neoliberalism is the extent to which it relies on state funding, and these guys went to the US on a kind of scholarship with US state funding, and obviously that what grew out of that was the Chicago Boys. So that's another contradiction inherent.
That's a good point. Thank you very much. Do we have any other? Yes, I see a hand there, and then I'll come back to you. Yes, please.
Thanks. I just wondered if the panel had any thoughts about whether any of these old men in the film could ever be brought to justice. I think they all should be in prison, probably, for collaborating with a genocidal regime.
Well, yes, they should, but whether they will, I doubt it. It's interesting that what happened in Chile, I think Britain, we all knew about Pinochet's detention here in London. So the case of Pinochet's crimes were quite well discussed in the press and known by the people here. However, it is presented as if it was the military that did all of this. But in the film itself, very surprisingly, Sergio de Castro, who was the main writer of the brick, El Ladrillo, was said, well, you were commissioned this document to do what? And he said, well, I didn't know. Well, maybe it was for something, but I don't know for what. That is absolutely unbelievable. So the participation, the connivance of the civilians, right-wing civilians in the whole process is absolutely proven. They participated at all times. I mean, Agustin Edwards meeting with Nixon, a foreign government, a Chilean betraying his own country by meeting the president of another country, and all of this information being released in documents by the United States. I mean, I'm sometimes surprised by how democratic the United States it is, that it lets us know 50 years afterwards of all of what it has done to other countries. But thanks to that release of documents and to the documents that John has had access to, declassified documents in Britain, we are learning the history 50 years after. And 50 years after, very often the people are dead, the people that are responsible. So we don't have the justice that is necessary.
Thank you very much. John, did you want to add anything?
No.
Thank you. And yes, sir, here, third row, please. Thank you.
How important do you think the neoliberal experiment in Chile was for the adoption of neoliberal economics by Thatcher and Reagan a few years later, and that we're living with still?
Can I just make one small point? Margaret Thatcher sent Cecil Parkinson to investigate the advantages of the model being done in Chile. That's all I know. And I think it's very early on, actually. I think Keith Joseph was, remember, the person who was inspiring Margaret Thatcher to follow the Friedmanite policies. But it was Cecil Parkinson that went to investigate what was going on in Chile very early on during her government.
Yeah, and even before her government, there was people like Alan Walters, I believe, during the mid-1970s, who was going over and basically studying what was happening in Chile. He would go on to be one of Thatcher's key economic advisors. And, you know, it wasn't just the neoliberalism. I mean, she looked at Chile as, with inspiration in the way that it dealt with. I mean, they both had such contempt for the left, that she really saw it as a kind of model in various different ways. And I think that Thatcher and Pinochet are also linked in such a concrete way, because obviously in 1982 there was the Falklands War, and prior to the Falklands War, Thatcher was the least popular UK Prime Minister since records had begun. After the war, she became one of the most popular according to the records, and obviously went on to remain Prime Minister for the next 8 years. And Pinochet's support during that war was massive. I mean, the Chilean regime shared military intelligence. Apparently, they might have even shared the coordinates of the Belgrano. Chilean air force bases were used by the Brits. And there was just wide military collaboration between Chile and Britain during the Falklands War, for which Argentinians still very much remember. And so there's a decent case to say that Pinochet, to some degree, it was responsible for Thatcher's re-election and her very political success. And you know, that friendship obviously endured well into the late 90s, when she was visiting him in the hospital, when she was visiting when he was under house arrest in Surrey after the extradition case had been opened in 1998. And she was his most staunch public defender in Britain at the time. I mean, some of her former ministers, Norman Lamont, for example, also defended him. But she was the most high-profile public defender. So, yeah, I mean, economically, they studied what Pinochet was doing in Chile, and they found inspiration in it. But I think there was a wider economic and political model that she supported as well, and that, you know, really came into reality during the time that they were both in power.
Thank you. Yes, we have a lady in in front. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ruby, and I've enjoyed the film in a sort of inverted commas way, because it's very powerful image of what we already know, or some of us know. The striking thing for me is how clearly we are shown the development of this dichotomy, where one part, or the polarization, if you like, one part of the country does one thing, the other one does something else, and there's no connection between them. And one part doesn't know, inverted commas again, about what happens in the other part, whereas the other part knows exactly what's going on over there, but they haven't got access. Now, that is the neoliberalism project, which I think has been terribly successful, and it's permeated to the base of the country, and it's really sad to see. I visit regularly. I don't get very much involved, but even if I don't want to get involved, I still see it and I still feel it. And that is that people have turned eventually over the years, quickly and slowly, to just a very selfish group of people. And it's really sad to see, where the selfishness is not so much because I want to be selfish, but because I don't want to know, a bit like these boys, because I can't really take on any more of the suffering or the struggles or the battles. People work hard. They may have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, and they don't really earn enough to survive. They barely just survive. But they're also very interested in acquiring things. And there is, the need to have more and more and to pay for that. And that is really, really painful to watch. So you want to speak to people about, what that might mean, but there is no possibility because there's no really clear education. In order for you to have good education, you have to have money to pay for it. You can't be critical because the critical thinking has also been thwarted. There was only one policy and there was no opposition or no criticism that would be accepted, and that's still the case. Debate is not something that you can find easily. I mean, if people start to have a discussion and they, have differences of opinions, things start to get very heated very quickly. So, you can see that. So that's kind of going back to your question initially, how has all this model permeated to the society or to just common people? This is what I observed. I'm not a social scientist. I just see it and feel it.
Thank you very much. Very interesting point. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that.
Maybe
Anything to it? Yeah?
I totally agree with what you said. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll hand shot up just there.
I just want to say, really, in terms of this selfishness, I've never been to Chile, but I see it all the time in this country, how selfish, how cruel we have become, and what we now find acceptable in terms of drowning people in the sea. So we are as infected by this neoliberalism project as Chile has become. And just a plug for another film. There's a film out at the moment called The Count, which portrays Pinochet as a vampire and Thatcher as a vampire. So I recommend people to go and see that. It seems both fantastical and all too true.
Have you actually seen? You've seen the
I've
film?
seen it. Yeah, it's Curzon Bloomsbury. It's going to be on Netflix, but it's quite an extraordinary film. Thatcher turns out to be Pinochet's vampire mother in it. So it does feel rather true, as I say.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the release of the film if anyone had seen it. Thank you for that. Very timely. Do we have any other questions in the audience? We've not been kicked out, so yes, yes, please. Sorry, mic at the front, please. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention that when we talk about neoliberalism, people tend to think about an economic model, but it's more than that. It's an economic model, it's a political model, and it's a cultural model. And that is the terrible thing, because it brings about, in order to fulfill, to get successful, it has to change the mind and the feelings and the heart of people, and it does it very successfully. And as you say, that people in this quest for more money become more and more individualistic, more selfish, and it's terrible, because as humans it dehumanizes people, and that's the sad thing about it. It's certainly it's very successful economically for certain people, but it's a terrible system for the majority of the people in the countries where this is so successful. And that is sadly this story of my country today, and of England as well, I have to say, in a way, and other countries where this is being implemented.
Yeah, and given the power of the countries that have implemented it, sadly it's international, isn't it? And you're right, the majority of people suffer from that model, and you would think, therefore, it just wouldn't work. There would be enough of a revolt. But the success lies in convincing people that it's the only model out there, it's the only way to live that's acceptable.
The only thing, there's nothing that represents better than what Margaret Thatcher said about there's no such a thing as a society. And that is really the essence of that. Yeah,
that's a very good point, thank you. Just an aside, it makes me think, if any of you haven't seen it, it's really worth watching how that kind of model of thought co-opts everything. It's I've got his name now. The documentary Century of the Self. Thank you, Adam Curtis, Century of the Self, which shows how even counterculture and things like the hippie movement were in the end co-opted by this line of thought to make them very much about the individual. But anyway, I'm complete aside. It's worth watching. Do we have any other questions or comments, or did anyone have anything to ask our guests? Yes, one question in the middle row.
Just a very, very small observation. Education. The new generations that didn't experience anything about the life before the coup, and that take everything that is happening as normal, as the things are now. Then that's how they are. They don't question. They don't criticize. There is no critical thinking. And there was somewhere else was talking, not here, about the failure of education to be wide enough and to be deep enough to start moving people who are now in their 40s, 50s. Yeah. The young people seems to have found somewhere how to move forward, but the middle-aged people that's sort of putting the brakes on, and some other I remember mentioned that there is no civic education in Chile. At the beginning I said, what has to do? Well, I did have civic education where you are told the basic workings of democracy. These people don't have them. So it's very difficult if you don't have a vision of how things could be, or how things, or your basic rights. And only that.
Thank you very much. It's a very good comment. Do we have any? I'm mindful of the time, but because my colleagues haven't come in yet to give us a 5-minute warning, the room's still yours if anyone wants to add anything to this. If not, oh yes, yeah, of course. So it's very dark out there, so I can
There
see
is a book which has been re-edited. It was produced at the time of the Pinochet affair in England. It's called Pinochet in Piccadilly. It is written by a fellow who is a columnist with The Guardian. I can't remember his name at the moment. That's the only problem, but he's...
Andy Beckett.
That's it. Well, the book is particularly strong on the relationship between Pinochet and the conservative government of Margaret Thatcher, and presents a lot of information on that. My only other point is that the film that we saw doesn't emphasize enough two facts. One is that the Chilean economy, the national product, went down systematically for at least 4 years after the dictatorship. And the recovery that they claim didn't get the levels of the 1973 until a lot later. So that is one economic element which is unmistakable because the figures are there. And the second element is that the Chilean economy really went up after Pinochet, with the arrival of the post-dictatorship political regimes. And there is when the Chilean economy really prospered, because during the times of the dictatorship, that wasn't the case. and what De Castro and others were saying there in the film is not true, simply is not true. Unfortunately, the film doesn't emphasize that strongly enough. And being a good film has got some economic or problems into the presentation of economic information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's good to have comments about the actual film itself as well, the way it's made, if you feel it's left anything out or things it's emphasized. So it's good to hear. Thank you very much. Do we have one final question or comment for the road? Or either of our guests? Of course, go for it.
There was one thing I was supposed to mention much earlier, I think, is that me and Roberto's son, Pablo Navarrete, we're working on a new documentary called Britain and the Other 9/11, and it's centred obviously around the coup, but it's a 40-year history of British covert interference in Chile between 1960 and 2000. We went to Santiago in June to do filming there. We interviewed the relatives of British nationals who were persecuted and killed by the Pinochet regime, torture survivors, leading journalists, former officials. And we're filming in the UK right now, this week, in fact. And yeah, so it's based on a lot of the recently declassified files, but also those that were, had direct experience of the dictatorship and who were persecuted by it as well. So there's flyers outside. If anyone is willing and able to support it, that would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, it's these that just outside the screen. The other side. Oh, what am I showing? Oh, there we go. Wrong film. The flyers are just outside the cinema on the little table where the plant is, if you want to grab them on your way out. On this note, thank you so much to my guests, Roberto and John. Big round of applause for coming and speaking. Thank you very much to you all for staying. That was a really great discussion. Thank you to the Garden Cinema, to my colleagues, and to Alborada for helping organise this screening. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Do you need a hand with anything? Do you need a hand with anything?